February 11, 1990. Tokyo, Japan. The Tokyo Dome. Mike Tyson stepped into the ring as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Undefeated in 37 professional fights, 33 of them ending in knockout. He was widely considered not just the best heavyweight on the planet, but one of the most dominant champions in the history of the sport. His opponent that night was a journeyman named James "Buster" Douglas, a fighter with a record that inspired no fear whatsoever, a career defined more by inconsistency than greatness, and odds that told the entire story before the opening bell ever rang.
That any prize fighter with a dog named Shakespeare can't be all bad.
Buster Douglas tells us that his favorite Shakespearean play is the romantic tragedy Romeo and Juliet.
The oddsmakers made Tyson a 42-1 favorite. Some sportsbooks in Las Vegas refused to even post a line for the fight, believing it was too one-sided to be worth taking bets on. Reporters covering the event treated the match as a formality, a routine title defense before Tyson moved on to a far more anticipated showdown later that year.
Now, you had 42-1 odds against you.
But you know what, though?
Nobody outside of Douglas's own small circle believed he had any real chance. His personal life had been in turmoil in the weeks leading up to the fight. His mother had passed away just weeks before he stepped into the ring. His marriage was falling apart. By almost every measure, this looked like a fighter walking into the worst possible matchup at the worst possible moment of his life.
You did have a physical advantage over him.
Right.
Which didn't work before, but this time is going to be a little bit different.
Right.
But something inside Douglas had shifted. His trainer had pushed him through the hardest training camp of his career, and Douglas, standing 6'4" with a reach advantage that few of Tyson's previous opponents had ever possessed, had a plan that nobody in the boxing world had bothered to consider seriously. The opening bell rang, and the entire arena expected the same story that had played out so many times before. Tyson stalking forward, closing the distance, ending things in a violent hurry. Instead, Douglas used his jab. Over and over, he kept Tyson at the end of his long left hand, refusing to let the champion get comfortable on the inside, where his power had always done the most damage. Round after round, Douglas did what almost nobody expected. He didn't panic. He didn't retreat into a defensive shell hoping to survive. He fought smart, controlled the pace, and even began landing clean combinations that visibly frustrated the champion. By the middle rounds, Tyson's frustration was becoming impossible to hide. He had never faced an opponent this size who refused to be intimidated, who kept finding the range with a stiff jab and quick combinations before Tyson could ever load up his signature power shots. Then, in the 8th round, the fight took a dramatic turn. Tyson connected with a vicious uppercut that sent Douglas crashing to the canvas. For a moment, it looked like the outcome everyone had predicted was finally arriving.
Tyson, he's always been the initiator. Here he's against the ropes. I've never seen.
And there's a right hand uppercut, and down goes Douglas.
Douglas took the count, rose to his feet, and somehow survived the remainder of the round. What happened next would become one of the most debated moments in boxing history. Many observers believe the referee's count had been slow, giving Douglas extra time to recover from a knockdown that appeared far more serious than it initially seemed. Whatever the circumstances, Douglas not only survived the round, he came back stronger than before. In the 9th round, he returned to his game plan, using his jab, controlling range, and refusing to let Tyson's power define the rest of the fight. By the 10th round, something had shifted in the arena. Tyson, the man who had never been forced to fight past the 3rd round in most of his career, looked exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly unable to solve the problem standing in front of him. And then it happened. Douglas unleashed a combination that would go down in boxing history. A short uppercut followed by a devastating 4-punch combination that snapped Tyson's head back and sent him crashing to the canvas in a way nobody had ever seen before. Tyson, dazed and disoriented, fumbled desperately on the canvas, trying to locate his mouthpiece, unable to beat the referee's count. For the first time in his professional career, Mike Tyson had been knocked out. The Tokyo Dome fell into stunned silence, followed by an eruption of noise as the reality of what had just happened set in. The undefeated, seemingly invincible heavyweight champion of the world, had just been knocked out by a 42-1 underdog that almost nobody believed had any chance of survival, let alone victory. The boxing world scrambled to process what had just occurred. Reporters who had walked into the arena expecting to file routine stories about another dominant Tyson title defense were now witnessing what would be remembered as one of the greatest upsets in the history of sports. Some initially couldn't believe the result was legitimate. Questions about the long count in round 8 sparked controversy that would follow the fight for years to come. But no amount of controversy could erase what had actually happened inside that ring. Buster Douglas, a fighter given no chance by oddsmakers, no respect by the media, and no belief from almost anyone outside his own camp, had done what only weeks earlier seemed impossible. He had beaten Mike Tyson, decisively and definitively, in a performance built on preparation, heart, and a refusal to be intimidated by reputation alone. To understand how unlikely this outcome truly was, you have to look at where Douglas had been just a year earlier. He was a fighter with a reputation for underachieving, a talented boxer who never seemed to bring his full effort when it mattered most. He had lost fights he was supposed to win. He had been written off not once but multiple times throughout his career, viewed by many as a heavyweight with all the physical tools but none of the discipline to use them at the highest level. That reputation followed him directly into the Tyson fight. Promoters didn't build the event around Douglas as a genuine threat. They built it as a stepping stone, a name recognizable enough to fill a broadcast slot before Tyson moved on to bigger, more lucrative fights later that year. Nobody involved in putting the event together, from the promoters to the broadcasters to the sportsbooks themselves, seriously prepared for the possibility that Douglas might actually win. That's what made Douglas's performance so much more than a simple upset. It wasn't just that an underdog had won. It was that a fighter with a documented history of underperforming under pressure had somehow found, on the single biggest night of his career, the exact combination of focus, conditioning, and emotional drive that had eluded him his entire professional life. His trainer, John Johnson, had pushed him relentlessly in the months before the fight, refusing to let Douglas fall into the same patterns that had derailed previous camps. And Douglas, fueled by grief over his mother's passing just weeks earlier, channeled every ounce of that pain into the most disciplined performance of his career. In the years that followed, the fight would be remembered not just for the knockout itself, but for everything it represented about the unpredictable nature of the sport. Boxing, more than almost any other discipline, has always carried the possibility that on any given night, preparation and heart can overcome talent and reputation. Douglas became the living embodiment of that truth. The victory also forced a permanent reevaluation of how the boxing world approached matchmaking against dominant champions. Tyson's aura had been so overwhelming that promoters and opponents alike had begun treating his fights as foregone conclusions rather than genuine athletic contests. After Tokyo, that assumption could never fully return. Every future opponent who stepped into the ring with Tyson did so knowing, somewhere in the back of their mind, that the impossible had already happened once before. Decades later, footage of that 10th round combination still circulates constantly among boxing fans, replayed and dissected frame by frame. Analysts continue to study Douglas's jab, his footwork, and his composure under pressure as a blueprint for how size, reach, and discipline can neutralize even the most feared punching power in the sport. Young heavyweights are still shown clips of that fight as proof that reputation alone has never been enough to guarantee victory inside the ring. The story also endures because of its deeply human elements. This wasn't simply a tale of an athlete executing a game plan. It was a story of a man processing grief, defying a lifetime of doubt, and finding, on the one night it mattered most, a version of himself that even he may not have known existed. That combination of raw emotion and technical execution is part of why the fight continues to resonate with fans who weren't even alive when it happened. Douglas fought that night, carrying grief for his mother, carrying doubt from an entire sport, and carrying the weight of odds that suggested he had no business being in the ring at all. And he silenced every single doubter with his fists rather than his words. And that is why, decades later, people still remember the night nobody gave Buster Douglas a chance against Mike Tyson. and he shocked the entire world. But that new status came with enormous pressure. Douglas, who had spent his career being overlooked and underestimated, now had to defend the very title that had seemed impossible to win in the first place. His first defense came against Evander Holyfield later that same year, and this time, Douglas entered the ring not as the hungry underdog with nothing to lose, but as a champion whose life had changed dramatically in a matter of months. The outcome of that fight would ultimately be different, but nothing about that result could diminish what happened in Tokyo. Some victories in sports are remembered not because they started a dynasty or led to years of continued dominance, but because of what they proved was possible in a single moment. Douglas's win over Tyson belongs firmly in that category. The story of that fight has been retold in documentaries, debated on sports panels, and referenced constantly whenever conversations turn to the greatest upsets across all of professional sports, not just boxing. It sits alongside moments that defined entire eras, a reminder that no matter how dominant an athlete appears, sports will always retain the capacity to produce the unexpected. For Buster Douglas, that single night in Tokyo would define his entire legacy. He never captured the sustained dominance that Tyson had built in his prime years, but he didn't need to. He had already delivered the one performance that boxing historians would study and discuss for generations, a reminder that on any given night, with enough heart and enough preparation, even the most impossible odds can be overcome. The months that followed the fight brought a whirlwind Douglas had never experienced before. Overnight, a fighter who had struggled to draw significant attention throughout his career became one of the most talked-about athletes in the world. He appeared on television broadcasts, was profiled by major publications, and found himself in a position few could have predicted just weeks earlier, as the reigning heavyweight champion of the world. For a generation of fighters who came after them, the lesson was unmistakable. Confidence built on reputation alone could be dangerous. Every training camp, every scouting report, every pre-fight prediction from that point forward carried an unspoken acknowledgement that even the most dominant champion could fall if an opponent brought the right combination of preparation and heart on a single night. Buster Douglas himself never fully returned to the heights of that Tokyo performance, but he didn't need to chase that level again to secure his place in the sport's history. He had already given boxing one of its most enduring moments, a story that transcended win-loss records and title reigns. Fans who know almost nothing else about his career still know exactly what happened on that February night in 1990. Douglas fought that night carrying grief for his mother, carrying doubt from an entire sport, and carrying the weight of odds that suggested he had no business being in the ring at all. And he silenced every single doubter with his fists rather than his words. Mike Tyson would recover from that loss and continue fighting for years afterward, but the aura of invincibility that had defined his early career was gone forever. No opponent would ever again step into the ring against him believing defeat was a foregone conclusion. The ripple effects of that single night reached far beyond the two men involved. Promoters across the sport began reconsidering how they built matchups around seemingly untouchable champions. Betting markets, which had once treated certain fighters as immune to genuine risk, adjusted permanently to account for the reality that any fighter, regardless of reputation, could be beaten on the wrong night against the right opponent. The Douglas upset became a permanent reference point, invoked whenever a heavy favorite faced an opponent given little to no chance.